Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of Maine Cooperative Extension's July Preserving the Maine Harvest webinar about pickling. I'm Kathy Savoie, and today I'm joined by three other colleagues. We've got Kate McCarty in the demo kitchen, Vina Lindley running the slideshow, and Laurie Bowen will be staffing our Q&A. This webinar series is designed to provide you with current USDA recommendations for preserving food safely at home. Our monthly webinars will feature foods in season corresponding with Maine's growing cycle throughout the year. The mission of the University of Maine Cooperative Extension is to help Maine people improve their lives through an educational process that uses research-based knowledge focused on issues and needs. Our educational programs include agriculture, horticulture, including the Master Gardener program, 4-H youth development, food safety, and nutrition. And finally, we want to let you know that the University of Maine is prohibited from discriminating on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, age, disability, and reprisal or retaliation for prior civil rights activity. Today, we will focus on pickling by making both quick pickles and fermented pickles and discussing the difference between the two. We'll demonstrate how to make both types of pickles and then explain your options for preserving them. First, some housekeeping. We have our webinar set up so that you can hear and see us, but we can't hear or see you. But we do want to answer your questions. So please ask them as they come up for you during our presentation by using the Q&A feature, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So thanks again for joining us on this hot summer day, and let's get started. So our green beans and cucumbers are starting to appear in Maine gardens and at our farmers markets. So it's time to kick off the pickling season. There are two methods for creating delicious homemade pickles: quick pack pickling and fermentation. Both methods achieve an acidic final product that helps to prevent spoilage organisms from growing, while also delivering those delicious tart pickled flavors that we love. When following the quick pack method, you acidify your cucumbers by adding vinegar, which inhibits the growth of spoilage organisms and develops flavor. When fermenting, it's the curing process that naturally produces lactic acid, which is responsible for creating that acidic environment. To start, we'll focus on how to make quick pack cucumber pickles. These types of pickles are fresh vegetables flavored with a mixture of water, vinegar, salt, and spices. This combination is known as the brine. These products are typically then canned in a boiling water bath canner for long-term storage as a shelf-stable item. We're going to break down everything you need to know about pickling ingredients to give you the best tasting, highest quality pickles you can make. There's a great variety of research-based recipes available for you to try. Classic dill, bread and butter, sour mustard, and a variety of pickled vegetables like one of my favorites, as well as my family's favorites, dilly beans or pickled green beans. The ingredients that make up the pickling liquid, or the brine, can affect both the safety and the appearance of your pickles. First, salt. Canning and pickling salt is recommended for use in pickling, as it is pure granulated salt. It does not have any of the additives like anti-caking agents or iodine that can cause your brine to turn cloudy or your pickles to darken. The other salts, like sea salt and kosher salt, don't have additives either, but can actually measure differently because of the crystal size. And this can result in under or over salted pickles. So it's best to use the canning and pickling salt to ensure a consistent final product. Next up, let's talk about vinegar. You want to make sure and look for 5% acidity on the vinegar label to ensure safety. We recommend that you don't use homemade vinegars, as the acidity can vary and may not create a safe final product due to that pH variability. White vinegar is usually the default vinegar, as it is very neutral in flavor, but you can use any kind of vinegar you like as long as it is 5% acidity. Try using apple cider vinegar in your sour mustard pickles or your bread and butter pickles for an interesting twist. For best results, use fresh pickling cucumbers. Pickling cucumbers have a thicker skin, they have less water in the flesh, and also smaller seeds, which will help, all those qualities will help to give you a crunchier pickle than if you try to use a variety grown for fresh eating. Some of those non-pickling varieties are commonly labeled as European, English, or slicing varieties. It's best to refrigerate your cucumbers after harvest and use them within 24 hours. It's not always possible to know when the cucumbers were harvested if you're purchasing them. So just make plans to pickle your cucumbers shortly after you buy them. A big concern around homemade cucumber pickles is crispness. You're never going to get that gloss and snap with home canned pickles, but there are several things that you can do to improve the firmness of your pickles. One tip is to prepare your cucumbers properly by cutting the blossom ends off. Be sure to remove a 1/16 inch slice from the blossom end of fresh cucumbers. That blossom end contains an enzyme which causes excessive softening of pickles. The blossom end is the one opposite the stem end, and Kate will be sure to show us that when we join her in the demo kitchen. You simply need to slice a sliver from this end to ensure that these enzymes don't cause your pickles to soften. If the stem is missing, you can also look for the lighter shade of the cucumber, and that is the blossom end. And you can see that shown in the slide in our anatomy of a cucumber. You may find that some pickle recipes call for steps like slicing your cucumbers, salting them, covering them with ice cubes, and refrigerating them for several hours. These steps are aimed at drawing out the water from the sliced cucumbers, which will give you a crunchier final product. So be sure to read through your recipe ahead of time so you don't begin your project only to learn your cucumbers need 24 hours of prep. Be sure to follow any of these steps to give yourself the best chance at crunchy cucumber pickles. Let's talk about those firming agents that you might see in the aisle of the grocery store. So there are several recommended firming agents for pickling. Extra Crunch or Pickle Crisp is a calcium chloride product sold either by Mrs. Wages or Ball. Calcium chloride helps to firm the pectin in cucumbers, helping to maintain some of that crunch. You add this product directly to the jars before you add your spice or vegetables in. Follow the directions that are provided on these products. It's just an 1/8 of a teaspoon per pint jar, so a very small amount of the product. We actually did do an experiment last summer and found the jars that had Pickle Crisp added in really did maintain a crunch more than the jars without. On to another product. Pickling Lime is a crisping treatment that is actually no longer recommended. It was recommended to soak your pickles in, and it did require several thorough rinses to safely remove the product before canning. So we recommend other ways to keep your pickles crispy. Alum is yet another one of these outdated recommendations for pickling. It only works for fermented pickles. And as long as you follow the advice we've given you here today, you really shouldn't have an issue with soggy pickles. Also remember that refrigerating them prior to serving them, they'll be served cold, so that will also help with the crispness factor. So now we're going to join Kate in the demo kitchen, and she's going to show us how to make a batch of her favorite quick pack pickles. Kate?
Hello. I am indeed going to demonstrate making the dill pickle. So just a classic dill is one of my favorite recipes. This recipe is from the National Center for Home Food Preservation, and we will indeed be including it in the resources that we send you this afternoon. So I'm just going to demonstrate how to prepare the recipe with a small batch of 2 jars. So with this recipe, I'm preparing it as a canning recipe. So I'm going to demonstrate how to fill the jars as if we were going to be canning them. However, you could also just choose to refrigerate these pickles if you are not interested in the canning process. They won't last as long, so you should make a smaller batch and keep them in your refrigerator. But Kathy will discuss ways to preserve your pickles if you want to make large batches of delicious fresh pickles this time of year. So to begin, Kathy wanted me to discuss the cucumbers that we got. So she found the pickling cucumbers at the farmer's market. They're distinct, they'll be labeled as such, but they have thicker skins. They're typically smaller and bumpier than your salad or slicing cucumber. We saved one that had the very distinct stem still on it. So then in this case, it's very clear which end is the blossom end. It's just the opposite end of the stem end. But if, like all the other cucumbers in this batch, they didn't have any stem visible. So we also saved this one because you can see that color distinction where the blossom end is the lighter end of the cucumber. So you would just slice off the lighter end of the two. And if you're like, I can't tell, because there were some that were just pretty uniformly green throughout. So if you can't tell which side is which, just cut off both ends and then you'll have covered all of your bases. So with my cucumbers sliced up and prepared, I have, again, 2 jars here. So we've got 1 jar that I added the spices to in the bottom already. So this recipe calls for garlic, dill seed, crushed red pepper, pickling spice, and mustard seed. So I'm going to prepare my other jar by just starting to add those ingredients in directly into the bottom of the jar. Vina, will you switch it? On my view, it looks like I'm still at the, there we go, my overhead cam. Thanks. All of these spices are just there for flavor. Of course, it does create the characteristic pickled flavor. So I typically follow them as written, but spices in preserving are just there for flavor. So if there are spices you want to either add in or leave out, you can opt for that. The crushed red pepper being one, whereas if you don't want very spicy pickles, you could leave it out if you want to just add a little bit or whatever. And then you can pack your cucumber slices in. So I just opted for a half for this demonstration. You could slice them into spears if you like. If you want chips, you would need to follow those pre-treatment steps. So you would want to find a recipe that was specifically for dill chips, because that will instruct you on how to process those ahead of time, like salting and rinsing or putting on ice and storing in the refrigerator for hours. All of those steps are aimed at drawing the water out to promote crispness in your pickles. But if you want to just do either halves or spears, you can just do those without the pre-treatment. So then once I've got my spears in here, I'm going to check the headspace because, again, we're going to be canning these. And the recommended headspace for pickles is 1/2 inch. So I'm using this headspace measuring tool, which has these little 1/4 inch steps on the bottom of it. And then the second one up from the bottom, I rest it on the rim of the jar. And then all of my pickles, cucumber spears are underneath of that 1/2 inch. And then I have a brine that I pre-prepared. It is vinegar, water, sugar, and salt. And you just heat that to boiling to dissolve the sugar and salt. And then I put it into a measuring cup, which you can see is going to really help make it easy to pour in there. So you could use the funnel if you're ladling it in, but with this pour on the measuring cup, it's nice. I don't need the funnel. So then I'm going to just cover up the spears, and then I'll come back and check the headspace after that's completed. Yeah, I'm still going for 1/2 inch of headspace with the liquid as well. So I just pour that until it comes up to the level. And this first jar I did is spot on, so that's fantastic. And then when you're canning pickles, so anything really that has vegetables or fruit with a liquid over it, you need to remove the air bubbles. So you use the other end of the headspace measurer and run it around gently, the outside of the veggies between the glass and the veggies. This just makes sure the brine is filled in underneath all of the pieces, so that if you have any trapped air in there and put it in the canner with the trapped air bubble under a cucumber, that could cause the jar to break. And I unfortunately have had dilly beans break in the canner, and it makes a royal mess, and then you waste the jar of your favorite pickles. So free the air bubbles and then double check the headspace. Yeah, this shrunk a little as it filled in around the pickles, so you can bring it back up by topping it off. And then you're ready to add the lid and put these into the boiling water bath canner. I need a little paper towel here to wipe off the rim of the jar where I might have splashed a little pickle brine. Get that nice and clean so that a good seal forms. And then apply the flat dome lid to the jars and the screw band until it's fingertip tight. So just tightened using only the strength of my fingers. And then these are ready to go into the boiling water bath canner. In my case, I'm just going to refrigerate them. So I'll just write right on the lid what it is, refrigerator dill pickles. And then I made them on July 21st here in 2022. All right, so with that, that is our quick pack pickle recipe demonstration. And I will transition to fermentation while Kathy tells you what that is and how it works.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Always fun to hear from Kate in the demo kitchen. So now we're going to move on and talk about how to create fermented pickles. First, let's take a look at how fermentation preserves your food. Fermenting is a curing process that involves soaking the cucumbers or other vegetables in a salt water brine for several weeks. Curing changes the color, flavor, and texture of the vegetables, developing those tangy, acidic flavors that we love. Fermentation also produces lactic acid, which helps to preserve the final product. This acid is produced as the lactobacillus family of bacteria, which is naturally present on vegetables, convert the sugars in the vegetables to lactic acid. The production of acid also causes the pH of the brine to drop, making it harder for spoilage organisms such as mold, yeast, and bacteria to grow. So fermentation not only produces those characteristic pickle flavors we love, but is also creating a safe environment to preserve our food as well. Just as with quick pickling, using canning and pickling salt is recommended. Avoiding additives like iodine is especially important when fermenting because iodine can also prevent fermentation from occurring. Salts like sea salt or kosher salt can measure differently because of the crystal size, resulting in undersalted pickles. Not using the right amount of salt can also be a big safety concern in fermentation, as salt does play a very important role in fermentation and creating a safe product. The salty solution helps to suppress the growth of unwanted pathogens before the bacteria produce enough lactic acid to keep pathogens from growing. So the correct amount of salt in your brine will prevent unwanted molds, yeast, and bacteria from forming, which can ruin your batch of pickles. Do not use less salt or reduced sodium salt in your fermented pickles, as it may create that unsafe environment for fermenting foods. On the other end, if you add too much salt, it can also prevent bacteria from growing, including the lactobacillus bacteria responsible for fermentation. So it is very important to use the right salt and the right measurement accurately. The fermented pickles recipe we use calls for the addition of a small amount of vinegar. Why should you add vinegar? The vinegar is not there to flavor your pickles, but rather to prevent pathogens from developing at the beginning of the fermentation process, before there are sufficient levels of lactic acid produced by the bacteria. So be sure to add the recommended amount of vinegar, ensuring, of course, that it is 5% acidity to your batch of fermented pickles. Once you have created the brine and submerged the cucumbers, the fermentation begins. This process can take anywhere from 1 to 6 weeks. Again, that's 1 to 6 weeks, as the bacteria produce lactic acid. You may see bubbling and a slight scum form on the surface. This is harmless and is actually a byproduct of fermentation. The pickles are done fermenting when the bubbling stops and you like the way they taste. After that, you can simply refrigerate your pickles, or you can can your fully fermented pickles. So we're now going to go back into the demo kitchen and visit Kate once again, and hopefully she's had enough time to change gears, and she'll be showing us how to make a batch of fermented pickles. And we are so excited to enjoy these in a few weeks. Kate?
We are. We're going to make a giant batch. So I'm going to demonstrate how to make a reasonable sized batch, and then we'll double it after our webinar. So I have not too frantically changed gears into making fermented pickles. And we're going to do a little show and tell to begin about the containers that you can ferment in. So the considerations around fermentation and the type of container you use is that it needs to be a food grade material. So your options are ceramic, glazed ceramic, plastic, or glass. And all of those, if you choose one of those, should be food grade. So metal is not recommended due to the interaction between the acidity that is going to occur, and the metal could cause unwanted changes in color or flavor. But if you're going ceramic, we're going to start with like the highest end. We call this the Cadillac of fermentation vessels because it is very large. So this is 25 liter, and I believe, forget, Kathy, how big that sauerkraut recipe is. It's like 25 pounds of cabbage that this holds. So it's a very large ceramic crock. I think it's made in Germany. It is, again, glazed, not unfinished ceramic, but great glaze with a food grade glaze. So it's designed to hold food. It has a cover to help keep dust and pests out. And then this has a water channel around it. So this acts as an airlock, which lets the gases that are produced during fermentation come out, but no dust or pests go in, or air exchange, which would allow unwanted potentially spoilage bacteria or molds or yeast to ride in on the air. So you would fill this with water, which would provide an airlock, and then the inside is glazed as well. It's very heavy. It came with some unfinished ceramic weights, which we didn't like because we felt like we had a batch that went bad, and then we're kind of concerned about how to clean the weights. So we were worried about it potentially infecting another batch. So we ordered these nice, cool weights that go in there. So these are designed to help weigh down your vegetables. Fermentation is an anaerobic process, which means it happens without oxygen. So in this case, it's happening underneath the brine. So all of your veggies need to be weighed down under the brine. So these glass weights go in there. And it's cool that they're clear, so then you can see down in there and see what's happening. So that's the big one. You'll see also smaller size ones that are just open on the top, and you can fashion all sorts of other weights to go in there that I'll discuss to weigh down your vegetables. Cucumbers float too, so you really need to be conscious of the weights when fermenting pickles. Then if you're using a plastic container, this is a food grade plastic bucket. That's what that yellow sticker says, it's food grade. I believe this came from like a beer and wine store. You can also get them at delis or bakeries. So any place that might order a bucket of pickles or like a pie filling or pastry cream or something. I think Amato's will sell them to you for a few dollars. So this is a big plastic 5-gallon bucket you can use. These Cambro containers come in all sizes. This is a 4-quart container, and it's food grade plastic, which would be a nice option for fermenting in plastic. Then in glass, we have a gallon size glass jar. This is made by Ball, but not for canning, just for fermenting and other food projects. The one we're going to be using is a 1/2 gallon glass jar. And then you can do smaller batches, of course, in your quart or pint size. So I think that's all the options for containers that I have in front of me. A lot of show and tell. We're going to hang on to the half gallon because that's the one I'm going to be demonstrating today. And I think I'll save the weights to when I get into it. So I'll begin the demonstration now. So if we'll switch to the overhead view, please. Fantastic. Thank you. All right, so this recipe, I have a chart printed out that we will be sending you, has the quantities for a quart, 1/2 gallon, or gallon. So I'm going to follow the 1/2 gallon one and use 2 pounds of pickling cucumbers. They were prepared in the same way as if we were using quick pickling. So we just cut the blossom, wash them, cut the blossom end off. And to this recipe, in addition to the cucumbers, we add some fresh dill. Just wash that up. That can go in there. You could use dill seed or dill seed heads if you're growing them in your garden and they're flowering. 1 clove of garlic, a teaspoon of crushed red pepper, a teaspoon of pickling spice. Oh, and there's dill seed in there for good measure. They're going to be nice and dilly. So you layer all of your spices in on the bottom and then pack the cucumbers in on top. So we want to pack these in neatly, and ideally we'll see how many we can get in here. And then also leave room for our weight to fit in on top. Okay. So you can see with the whole cucumber, these jars fill up pretty fast, where you think 1/2 gallon, that sounds like a lot, but it's really, once you taste them, you'll see it's never enough. So I think I'm gonna stop there just to allow adequate headspace to really make sure that I can cover them all in brine and then allow for that weight. So I don't know, that was about 10 or so. And then I've prepared a brine ahead of time because it needs to cool. So this brine is just water with salt, the pickling and canning salt. And then we did add a little bit of vinegar, like Kathy said. That's just to help ensure that the bad bacteria don't get a leg up during the beginning portion of fermentation. So the few days before the brine starts to become acidic from the lactic acid bacteria, potentially you could have some spoilage organisms grow in there. So the big thing in fermentation is to make sure your hands are well clean, your jar is clean. You're ideally just trying to reduce the amount of germs that go into this product, because the biggest thing that could threaten your delicious fermented pickles is going to be the spoilage from molds, yeast, or bacteria. Okay, so I just cover these with enough brine. And then we still want to leave a little bit of space, like 1 to 2 inches up at the top, to allow for the bubbling that's going to occur during fermentation. Ferments can have a tendency to overflow if they're filled up too much. So with that, it is time to weigh down our pickles. The nice thing about the shape of this jar too is that I kind of wedged the cucumbers underneath of the shoulder of the jar, where it starts to bump out underneath the rim. And so that also keeps these cucumbers from floating. So they're not even actually floating at all, which is nice. But to be sure, we are still going to weigh it down. So we have a variety of weights, styles. You can use anything, again, that's food grade, that will fit inside your jar and keep your pickles from floating. So they make these cute little pickle weights, such as like a little glass, paperweight looking thing with a handle. And that works pretty well. We might be able to go with that. These are great for quart jars because they're about the same diameter as a quart. Other options, if you don't have a fancy pickle weight, is just a straightforward plastic bag, zip top plastic bag, and I just filled it with some brine, some leftover brine. So we can use that as a weight. The water, it's very full, so I'm afraid to let go. It's going to overflow. Okay, that's a little bit more full than I would like, but you can see the general concept. So the bag is nice because it fills in the gaps and really makes an airtight seal and prevents anywhere where the mold could grow. And we fill it with brine instead of water, just because if this were to leak, it would leak brine into your solution, and so it wouldn't mess with the concentration of your brine. Versus if you added water and it were to start leaking in, it would dilute your brine solution, which we wouldn't want. So I think I'm gonna go with the original pickle weight. Seems to be the least overflowy. Ball also has started making these spring weights. So this would fit into a jar underneath of the lid. The lid would be required to provide the pressure of the spring. And this is great for sauerkraut because of the little pattern on the bottom, provides nice coverage for a little shredded piece of cabbages that want to stick up through the brine. And then if you have a larger size container, we also have this cool glass weight as well. So lots of options, you know, of course, any hobby, there's tons of accessories that go with it, but if you want to be low tech, the brine bag works great. So then once you've got your veggies weighted down properly, you're happy that everyone's underneath the brine. You want to cover up your ferment, so you can cover it with just a coffee filter, perhaps a rubber band. So this again is going to let the off-gassing occur from fermentation. So the fermentation byproduct gases can come out and no dust or pests can get in. You can also cover it up with just a dish towel and do the same thing. And then once you have it covered, you're happy with your fermenting arrangement. I like to put it on a plate. So mine overflowed a little bit, which goes to show. It's nice to have it on a plate in case it overflows during the fermentation process. It won't overflow onto your counter. You can contain any spilled brine on a little plate there. All right, so then once you're happy with this setup, you put it in a relatively cool room temperature spot and let it sit for a few weeks. So again, that's done when you like the way that it tastes and the bubbling has stopped for the most part. So keep an eye on it. Notice any changes. You should be checking it every few days. Use your clean hands or a clean utensil to get in there and skim off anything that might form. So if mold starts to grow and you're checking it frequently, you can remove the bits of mold and continue to ferment without concern. If you let it go too long and it gets completely covered in mold and it's all throughout, it's best to discard it and begin again. There is also a scum that can form. Sounds really appealing, but the scum is a safe byproduct of fermentation. And so you'll want to remove the scum as it forms, but it's not something that you need to be concerned about from a food safety perspective. So Vina is showing a nice picture of the scum that can form. And then on the next slide, this is again, harmless, regular byproduct of fermentation, but the next slide is a moldy batch. And so that is something that, you know, is formed pretty quickly, but you'll want to stay on top of and remove. And if you can look down through it and see that it's underneath the brine as well, I would discard it. It's a matter of your personal comfort on how moldy you want your food to be. I typically err on the side of, you know, trying to keep that pretty clean and keep it removed so that I feel good about eating the final product. So once it's fully fermented, you have the option of, again, refrigerating it or canning it. Kathy's going to discuss more about the different ways that you can preserve your large batches of fermented pickles. All right, that's it for me.
All right, thanks a bunch, Kate. I know for me, I'd love to have, and this won't surprise you, Kate, I'd love to have a bay leaf in with all of my pickles. So I know that's in some of the all the pickling spices, but anyways, I love a whole big bay leaf in there for an extra boost of bay flavor. So if you've got questions, we encourage you to put them in the Q&A box. We're going to be having time for questions coming up. But let's then talk about what are those methods to be able to can your pickles at home. So pickles can be canned using the boiling water bath canner, as vegetables are an acidic product when pickled. Boiling water bath canning is the recommended method to ensure a vacuum seal and that you are achieving a shelf-stable jar of pickles. The atmospheric steam canner is another safe alternative for processing. So be sure to follow a tested recipe from a trusted source, like the ones we recommended here today. The recommendations we deliver are up to date and help to reduce your risk of food spoilage or foodborne illness. To learn more about the boiling water bath or the atmospheric steam canning methods, we recommend watching one of our past webinars on the topic. So we're now going to switch gears and head to Laurie, who is staffing the Q&A box, to see what we've got for questions. Laurie?
We don't have any questions just now, but I kind of have one. When it comes to the vinegar being added, you know, when you start your fermenting process, would that apply to sauerkraut as well?
Well, when we make sauerkraut and we follow the USDA Complete Guide for Home Canning recommendations, you are actually you have a lot of hands-on work to get your sauerkraut ready for the fermentation process. And you are simply mixing together the canning and pickling salt with the shredded cabbage. And that hands-on work with gloves on your hands, because that's going to be a ready-to-eat product, you are really doing a lot of active massaging of the product, the shredded cabbage with the salt, and that creates its own brine. So you really do a lot of work to achieve that, and you do not need to add any extra vinegar to that process. But plan on a lot of hands-on work ahead of time.
Thanks, Kathy. I still don't have any questions in the chat.
Okay.
So.
All right. Well, we will carry on, and I'll talk for a minute about one thing that I mentioned, which was, you know, can you mix up the spice mixture based on your personal preference when making the pickles at home? And the answer to that is yes. And you heard Kate reiterate that when she was talking about the crushed red pepper. Some people love crushed red pepper. Some people add extra crushed red pepper, and some people avoid putting it in at all. So that's the same for a lot of those spices. And then we also do recommend the whole spice, not the powdered products. Any powdered spices or ground spices are apt to give your brine a very cloudy appearance. And if you're someone who keeps an eye out on the latest pickles, you're probably all familiar with the sour mustard pickles that actually look like they're in a pickle cloud. They've got so much powdered mustard in them. So that's just kind of an extreme example of what can happen with powdered spices versus the whole spices. Not a safety issue, just a visual appearance that will look a little different. So we're going to keep going unless without any questions in the Q&A box, I'll see if, does Kate have anything else that she wanted to?
Kathy, I'll ask a question too if
Perfect.
you have time. So Kate mentioned different lids. I'm pretty new to fermentation, so I was wondering, with that spring weight that you talked about, Kate, how does that work if you put a regular canning lid? How do you get that air exchange that you were talking about?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, as I was like introducing that, I was like, oh, the whole lid issue thing. So you do need to account for the off-gassing that fermentation does. So that means that it's not recommended to screw a regular canning lid, or if you can repurpose the jar like a commercial lid onto the jars, because I mean, you will see some sources that say you can do that, but just remember to burp your jar every day. I wouldn't recommend doing that because if you forget, the jar could explode and then shower, fermented vegetable juice and glass all over your kitchen. So that spring system specifically that Ball sells is part of a fermentation kit, and it comes with a plastic lid that's very similar to the white plastic storage caps that you see sold. But then it has a little vent in it. So it's got little holes with a little silicone flap over it so it can off gas. So the lid is necessary, but I wouldn't use it with a regular canning lid unless you're extremely diligent about burping your jars, but rather use that lid that allows for off gassing.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I've really enjoyed using that particular kit because it is quite handy, and it makes a small amount of product, not like I believe, Kate, in front of you, you're loading up the 1 gallon, right? And as Kate mentioned, once you taste them, it's never enough. So, so it might look like a lot to you, but trust me, they don't go far at a family picnic.
These were the winner of our office-wide taste test compared to all the other home canned pickles we had. And that is primarily because they weren't heat treated, and so they're very crunchy, but they're also delicious.
Yes, they are. So let's see, we're gonna continue on, and recognizing that is the content of what we have for today's class on Pickling Basics. So here's the information on our recommended resources, and you will get all of these resources in the follow-up email that Kate sends out, along with the program evaluation. And if you do complete the program evaluation, you'll be able to enter your name and your mailing address to receive a free headspace measuring tool that is used in canning. You saw Kate demonstrate that during the kitchen demo portion of today's class. So mark your calendar. We'll be back next month to demonstrate canning and freezing tomatoes. And it is a season for growing tomatoes in Maine. We've got plenty of heat here this summer. So hopefully many of you will have plenty of tomatoes that you're looking forward to finding something to do with them. And I can attest to the fact that if we continue to have the heat that we have today, one of the easiest things to do and ways to get yourself out of the kitchen the quickest is to simply freeze them. So we'll be talking more about that, and we'll be sure to share resources and recipes from today's topic and registration for our next webinar via email. So be on the lookout for that. And I just want to double check. We do not have any other questions in the Q&A box. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and hope to have you with us in August. Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks everyone.